The members of the Commission, Father Robert Gahl and Father Santiago Sanz, are already here present, so I think we can start. I'm sorry if I am giving access to the other people, so I am interrupting myself. Wow, very active this conference. Okay, let's see. I think we can start. So I think that I suppose that all the discussion has to be in English because everybody is, I think, in United States except the Commission. We are here in Rome. It's difficult for the people, for the public, to identify ourselves, but I am Father Rafael Martínez, and I am the President of the Commission. Father Santiago Sanz is the second member of the Commission and co-director in some way of the thesis, and Father Robert Gahl is the third member of the Commission. We are starting now the discussion of the thesis of Father Carlos Miguel Viego, that is entitled Truth on Relativism in the Thought of Joseph Ratzinger. Well, as usual, the candidate to the doctorate degree has now the possibility of presenting the thesis during a time at 20 minutes, half an hour. I will ask to everybody, please, to switch off their microphones in order to not having interruptions or some background rumor. Thank you very much. And Father Carlos, you can present your research.
Thank you, Father Martínez. The title of my dissertation is Truth and Relativism in the Thought of Joseph Ratzinger. This doctoral dissertation is an investigation into Joseph Ratzinger's treatment of the problem of relativism today and how he attempts to answer relativism with the truth. In this thesis, we examine, present, and synthesize Joseph Ratzinger's exposition of the nature and the role of truth in human thought and life, as primary to human thought and life, and how Joseph Ratzinger presents the humility, the responsibility, and the boldness necessary for the pursuit and acquisition of truth as an adequate method for appropriately answering the challenges, and answering the challenges presented by the philosophical relativism prevalent in our time. There are three chief reasons we deem this investigation to be an important contribution to the field of philosophical studies. First, the dissertation addresses the central problem of our age, which is an intellectual crisis. The coronavirus is not the main problem. The thesis sheds light on that crisis, the central problem of our age, which is an intellectual crisis, and proposes a reasonable solution to it, drawing from one of the greatest intellectual authorities of our age, who has contributed his life's work to identifying that crisis and attempting to find the right solution and a way forward for humanity. Second, and more specifically, we deem this investigation important, an important contribution to philosophical science, because this thesis attempts to present a coherent answer to the prevailing present crisis in philosophy and science, which has subordinated philosophy to science philosophy, and religion to science, and therefore relegated the discussion of truth to the so-called experts in the hard sciences. Since Descartes, modern and postmodern thought increasingly presumes that all questions of knowledge and truth are limited to the area of scientific knowledge, mathematics, physics, chemistry, biology, and the experimental methods of those sciences. And that philosophy, with her deeper and universal metaphysical questions about the meaning of the world, the meaning of life, specifically of human life, where we come from, where we are going, has nothing to say, which cannot be defined within the scientific schema. Any philosophical contribution is bound to be strictly limited to the methodologies of science. Philosophy has therefore lost its proper realm, content, and method, which Joseph Ratzinger claims must be recovered for the sake of philosophy and of theology, and for the sake of science and of mankind. A third reason, the third and final reason this research should prove valuable, in my estimation, is that it, being undertaken in English, should have the breadth of a wide reading audience. And that should make Joseph Ratzinger's contribution in this area and the path he has begun more evident and more easily accessible to many. And his work will thus be more able to help disentangle and direct the difficulties of the present globalized culture. And this for three reasons. First, this wide breadth audience, this contribution of the thesis being done in English is important for three reasons. First, there are very few scholarly books on the philosophy of Joseph Ratzinger, though there are many studies in his theology. Second, the biography, the thought, and the works of Ratzinger's philosophical mentors are entirely absent and barely known in English, namely his three most important philosophical influences, which were his professor Gottlieb Söhngen, and then the author which most influenced him, Theodor Steinbüchel, who was also a professor at the Munich University when Joseph Ratzinger was in philosophy, and the personalist philosopher, Catholic philosopher, Ferdinand Ebner. Third, there are some very important works containing, the third reason this thesis in English is important is that there are very important works containing the philosophical aspects of Ratzinger's thought, which we examine in our thesis and which have not yet been published in English. For example, his first and award-winning doctoral thesis on Augustine, completed in 1951, 69 years ago this Sunday, June 28th. And the original version of his habilitation thesis on Bonaventure, originally finished in 1955, neither of which have yet been translated into English. Our work seeks to contribute to the fundamental understanding of Joseph Ratzinger in all of these, his philosophical foundations, and thus to be of some relevance to all further scholarly work on his thought. Regarding the method of our investigation, we examine, compare, and attempt to synthesize all of the basic texts of our author on the topics of truth and relativism. The most relevant texts are several of his books, listed here in the order of their importance regarding our topic. First, Truth and Tolerance, 2003, Introduction to Christianity, 1968, Principles of Catholic Theology, 1982, Dogma and Preaching, 1973, The Nature and Mission of Theology, 1993. 4 major September discourses on culture delivered as Pope Benedict XVI, and the 2 doctoral theses, the one on Augustine in 1951 and the one on Bonaventure in 1955, and the accepted version of 1957. Those are the main texts we use as our guide to gather, identify, and systematize the major fundamental philosophical questions raised by Joseph Ratzinger throughout his works, and to determine the constant line of his thought, while also considering some secondary literature in support of his ideas. We do this with the ultimate goal of arriving at a comprehensive view of the philosophical foundation of the thought of Joseph Ratzinger. We attempt to identify his lodestar. How does he reason? What are the principles that guide his investigation, understanding, and presentation of the truth in answer to relativism? How does he answer relativism, and is his answer adequate? Some difficulties which we encountered in our investigation were the lack of a systematic presentation of either relativism or truth by Joseph Ratzinger. He never actually defines either one of those terms in a systematic way. Second, the large quantity of literary output of our author. Again, not systematized, but with very many repeated and overlapping publications of his essays in his numerous books. And third, a third difficulty in this investigation has been to do this work from the USA, remote from the Rome University setting. To remedy the first difficulty is actually the main purpose of this thesis, which was to gather and explicate the thought of our author on this matter in a coherent way. Working from home, the third difficulty, solved the second difficulty regarding access to the literature, because it made collecting the Ratzinger published works into our library, as you can see around me, a reasonable option, which we did. And thus, being able to work from our own library turned out to be a great benefit of working remotely from home. Now for the content of the thesis. In this thesis, we show the philosophical truth response to relativism by Joseph Ratzinger. We do this in 3 chapters. First, Ratzinger's intellectual formation. Second chapter, Ratzinger's understanding of relativism. And third, Ratzinger's understanding of truth in response to relativism. In the first chapter on Ratzinger's formation, we present Joseph Ratzinger's academic formation within his cultural and historical context, and we examine the major philosophical influences which formed his thought. The Catholic cultural context of his upbringing and the horror of war are the first part of that chapter. Then we see also that young Joseph was academically and liturgically enthusiastic and had a thorough training in Latin and Greek classical education in his early years. In his philosophy seminary formation, he became interested in the experiential emphasis of he became especially interested in the experiential emphasis of the Christian faith in St. Augustine and in John Henry Newman, influenced by the prefect of his seminary, who was Alfred Lepple, who was at that time writing his doctoral thesis on Newman under the professor Theodor Steinbüchel. The most important part of that training in Joseph Ratzinger's philosophical preparation were 2 works, both by Theodor Steinbüchel. One on the personalism of Ferdinand Ebner, The title in German is Der Umbruch des Denkens, which is translated the upheaval of thought, or the redemption. I prefer to say the redemption of thought. It is a short work on the concept of the Christian according to Ferdinand Ebner, and of the human person. And the other most influential philosophical work, also by Theodor Steinbüchel, is a treatise, an exhaustive treatise, large two-volume philosophical foundations of Catholic ethics. It is in those Steinbüchel works, above all, that one sees the main ideas in the constant philosophical thought of Joseph Ratzinger regarding relativism and the truth in response to it, the truth of the person. Ratzinger's professor Gottlieb Sungen and the two Ratzinger theses under his direction, the first, People and House of God in Augustine's Ecclesiology, and the second, The Understanding of Revelation and the Theology of History of Bonaventure, were likewise foundation in the young student's understanding of relativism and truth. And we examine the philosophical ideas treated in them in the first chapter. In the second chapter on relativism, we examined the sources and the meaning of the present day problem of relativism, with its particular biases and objections to the truth. Relativism is the philosophical stance that all truth is a matter of perspective, that the truth is determined entirely by individuals or groups of individuals according to their own ideas and for their own specific place and time. In other words, according to relativism, there is no absolute universal truth applicable to everyone, everywhere, at all time. We identify and explore 4 areas of relativism in that second chapter treated by Joseph Ratzinger, attempting to systematize Ratzinger's treatment of relativism. We identify 2 types of what we would call metaphysical relativism. The first, religious relativism, and the second, philosophical relativism. And the 2 types of relativism under what we would call moral relativism. Individual moral relativism, the third type of relativism treated by Ratzinger, and political relativism, the fourth. So religious relativism, philosophical relativism under metaphysical relativism, individual moral relativism, and political relativism under moral relativism. The common element which we found in Joseph Ratzinger's assessment of relativism is the denial of ontology, the branch of metaphysics, the metaphysical root of the problem, the branch of metaphysics which considers the reality of things in themselves. The rejection of the philosophy of being blocks man's access to reality, to understanding the meaning of things, and especially the meaning and the purpose of human existence and of the world. That would be our assessment of Ratzinger's view of what relativism is and what and the difficulty therein. In the third and final chapter on truth, which is on truth in Ratzinger in response to relativism, we examine Ratzinger's treatment of the primacy of truth in relation to relativism, which includes what is truth, why is it necessary, what is the purpose of truth, and what is the deepest meaning of truth, as Ratzinger's answer for the problem of relativism in our time. Truth, according to Ratzinger, is the meaning of things, the logos. And when Ratzinger treats the word logos, he is considering it in its fullest sense, which includes the ancient notion, the ancient Greek notion of logos. He uses it in the sense of St. John in the Gospel, which includes the philosophical sense, the metaphysical sense, but also so it includes the philosophical sense of the meaning of things looking from the earth toward heaven, but it also includes, above all, the perspective from above, from heaven, the theological perspective, that the Logos is a person, the Logos is God. It is the foundation, the Logos is the foundation and the meaning of the world. The Logos is Christ. And the primary truth of the person is the Logos. The person of God is the Logos, Jesus Christ. And the Logos is man, because Jesus Christ is perfect man, in the image and likeness of God, which applies to every man. The meaning of everything is the person. The ultimate source of the meaning of everything and the purpose of everything is the person, relationship, love. Ratzinger's treatment of the truth of the person, would agree with John Paul II in his first encyclical, Redemptor Omnis, the first line of his first encyclical, that Jesus Christ is the center of the world and the center of history. The person of God and human persons are the center of the world because they're the image of God. Ratzinger responds to relativism by maintaining that concern for the particular historical and material reality, scientific truth, customs, historical conditioning are all legitimate aspects of the truth. All of this is in the 3rd chapter and in the conclusion of the thesis. Relativism, that the concern for the historical realities, the facts, is important, but that cannot be absolutized. There is a greater meaning. That reality is much greater than what we can measure, manipulate, or even know by experiment. And here I would like to interject that regarding the coronavirus, we've seen a perfect example of this. The past 6 months, the whole world has been watching, kind of baffled at how the scientific community and the political community struggled to try to figure out something that it could not apparently figure out. And so there were thousands of contradictions along the way because of the limited reality of the facts. The numbers are far from the facts, as we've seen. And what do they mean anyway? I mean, they leave one more perplexed than satisfied. Utilitarian technology cannot have the last word because man, this is Ratzinger, because man, this is Ratzinger's thought on the truth. Utilitarian technology cannot have, and the limits of relativism, utilitarian technology cannot have the last word because man and the world itself are greater than matter. Man is more than matter, and he knows more than matter, and he is therefore called to more. He is responsible for more. You'll permit me again to the coronavirus. One of the funniest things about it is the way politicians determine what is essential for man and what is not essential. Man is not just matter. So eating was important, but eating the Eucharist was forbidden. Man is, and Ratzinger would say, man is not just matter, but a person, which means relationship. Thank God they didn't prohibit people from speaking to each other in their own homes. Man is a creature. He did not make himself, according to Ratzinger. He was made by God, by God's love, freely. Man doesn't make himself, and he doesn't fully determine himself. He doesn't determine the nature of his being. He was made by God's love freely, ex nihilo, which means his coming to be is neither necessary nor arbitrary, but deliberately willed in love. Man is made by love and for love, for relationship. God makes man out of love and makes him for love. That means that man realizes himself by giving himself freely in love, by personal commitment. And he is fulfilled, man is fulfilled insofar as he images God in giving himself as God gives himself. In the most blessed Trinity, he gives himself. And in the person of Christ, incarnation and passion and death and resurrection and return to the Father, he gives himself in humble obedience. And man is called to make the same gift, every man. And that is the paradigm for every man. The sort to get out of oneself, self-transcendence. This is Ratzinger's point, that metaphysics, that first of all, science is a form of transcendence. We get out of ourselves and we study things. This is a manifestation of God's gifting of himself. And then man goes to metaphysics, which is another further manifestation, another level of the gift of transcending what we can just see with our minds and understand the meaning of things beyond what just hits the senses. And then metaphysics is open to the supernatural, to God, which is the ultimate reality, the ultimate self-transcendence, that the whole world is in the hands of another, the great other, God. The source of all truth, therefore, lies in the Creator and the relationality, the gift in God, within the Trinity, and in the gift which is creation, of God going out of himself gratuitously, and of man in the image of that. Man realizes himself by the sincere gift of himself. And here we must note that idea, Ratzinger ensured that it would find itself into the Second Vatican Council. It is Gaudium et Spes 24, in which Joseph Ratzinger had a hand. The truth of the person is how Ratzinger answers metaphysical relativism, affirming that the world, and especially man in the world, have meaning from the love of the Creator. That the two types of metaphysical relativism, religious relativism and philosophical relativism, are answered. God is real. The first type, religious relativism, is answered because God is real because he is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It is in the person that Ratzinger answers the religious relativism. But God is real because he is a person, because he is love. We know that he is real, and the creator of all that, and because he is the creator of all that is, who gives thereby meaning to all things. God is 3 in 1 relationship. That is it, period. That is the fundamental truth of what it means to be a person. That is a distinctively Christian notion of God, based on a unique revelation, that to be a person is the foundational truth in God, and that is no mere myth. God in person. The person is relationship. God is person. The truth of the person it also answers philosophical relativism, because relationality is also the greatest truth known by man, and it is involved in all of existence. We begin in the womb of a person. Even today with our technology, every man has to humble himself from the beginning of his being and receive his being from another. A terrible image of God. Personal relationality is the foundation, source, and purpose of the world. Truth itself is relational. Ratzinger considers the classical scholastic definition of truth in this regard, adequatio rei et intellectus. And whereas the scholastics emphasize the rei aspect of the definition of truth, the thing aspect, Ratzinger puts the emphasis, the weight on the adequatio, on the relational aspect of truth. That man, again, it's the transcendence of man, that truth is not a thing, is not an idea. Truth is a relation between man and the world. Rei et intellectus. The mind of man captures the things that exist. There's an adequate correspondence, the relationship. The truth of the person is the answer to individual moral relativism, because man is made for love, for the perfect maturation and orientation of eros in agape. This, incidentally, is I didn't mention it in my thesis, but it comes to me now that eros, I do allude to it in the thesis. Ratzinger speaks of eros and agape, and the necessity of eros for man, because we are bodily beings. The passions are part of our being. The passions are good, but they need to be oriented. And I would say that is the good in the LGBTQ movement. The good in that movement is that they have an intuition that eros is good. You're not bad because of your feelings. Your feelings do not make you bad. Where that movement errs is that it tends to reject the truth of metaphysical truth of who a man is and who a woman is, and who God is, and our relation to God and the world. And the truth of the person as made for others is the answer to political relativism, because it is for that reason alone that each and every person is inviolable, because of the nature of the person as a person, which is made for love, to be loved and for love, and never to be used simply as a means to an end. Man is a person who is inviolable. Every man, which is hallowed, which is codified in our constitutions throughout the Western world. The person is inviolable, made to be loved and defended, served, affirmed, and promoted for his own sake, never to be used simply. This is another wonderful thing we've seen with COVID-19, is that it's marvelous that the whole world is willing to sacrifice its convenience for the sake of the persons who might be in danger. I don't want to get into the politics of it, but that principle of putting everything, every material thing at the service of the person, that's exactly Joseph Ratzinger. That is the source, meaning, and purpose of the entire moral law and of all civil society, to serve each individual person, the upholding the dignity of the person, the honor due to every man as person. I'd also like to say that the Black Lives Matter movement is based on the same principle. Thus, according to Ratzinger, the person, the self-realization by freely giving oneself in history to God and to others, that is the truth which is the fundamental meaning of the world and of man. It is the meaning of the entire moral law and of all reality. The person is the meaning of the created universe and of heaven. It's all relationship. As one lady said on the subway in New York to Father Bob Connor, she said, she blurted out when she saw him in his Roman collar, she said, "Father, it ain't religion, it's relationship." And Bob said, "You're right." That's exactly Joseph Ratzinger's thought. It's all relationship. Even heaven, in fact, according to our author, is not a place but a person. Jesus Christ, God with us, and we in him with God. It is the communion of the saints. Heaven is the communion of the saints in the divine communion. That's so much for the content of the thesis. Now, a couple of areas that may serve to further the research done herein in my thesis, further ideas for further study, might be a comparison between the personalism of Joseph Ratzinger, which he gets from Ferdinand Ebner, and that of Karol Wojtyla. Another investigation might be a comparison between the personalism of Joseph Ratzinger and that of St. Thomas Aquinas. A couple of authors that would be very important in that study would be Edith Stein and Robert Barron. We did not treat those topics in any depth in our thesis because neither of those authors are directly involved in our specific focus, which is the thought of Joseph Ratzinger. And finally, here I should like to thank Holy Cross University for the unique opportunity to undertake this stimulating exercise these past 6 years in the doctoral program and the preparatory year of licentiate courses. 7 years I've been at it. I feel like Jacob working for Rachel. I'd like to thank especially Reverend Dr. Rafael Martínez, the president of the commission here today, my thesis director, for his generous assistance Don Rafael, te agradezco de corazón todo lo que has hecho por mí durante estos 7 años. Generosamente, gracias. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Santiago Sanz, for your expert review and suggestions throughout this work. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Robert Gahl, for the kindness of stepping in to serve on this board for my defense, even at this late date, at the end of this peculiar academic year. Thanks to Mr. Egidio Lombardi for facilitating some of the practical matters for me, even at long distance. And of course, I am most grateful to God and to my family and friends, especially in the Presbyterate, who have unwaveringly supported me throughout this project, some of whom are joining us on this video conference. God bless you all for this kindness, and may the Immaculate Virgin Mary cover you with all her sweet love. Thank you. Did something happen? Am I still on the meeting?
Yes. So I'm not sure if our president is coordinating right now, but Father Peter West seems to have activated presenting his own screen, and that seems to have interrupted some things.
He needs to deactivate it.
Exactly.
But you can continue to speak. Just ignore him.
I think it's Father Martínez's moment. If he can hear me, he's online.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yes. Okay. I think the problem has been solved. Okay. Thank you very much, Father Carlos Viego. Now it's the turn of the Commission to present their observations or suggestions. First of all, Father Robert Gahl, is your turn. Please.
Okay, thank you, Father Martínez, and thank you, Pancho, Father Viego. I'm going to adjust my own layout here. Okay. So I'm a little bit emotional. I'm especially emotional because of the quotation that you offered us, Father Viego, from Father Bob Connor, who apparently is online, and of that woman whom he met on the bus, which was especially amazing. It's a very strong affirmation, which is truly pertinent to this dissertation, but it's especially amazing. It must be some act of the Holy Spirit that she happened to say that to Father Bob Connor in particular. It's not religion, but it's the relation, or whatever it was exactly. Now, this is my opportunity to make my comments and a kind of analysis, and at least the beginning of an evaluation of what I found with this doctoral dissertation. I was a little bit involved way at the beginning of the project because I had some heart-to-heart conversations with Father Viego at the beginning of this project. And some of what I'll say is kind of strangely, ironically related to those original conversations that we had at that time, quite a few years ago. But first of all, my really deepest congratulations for this passionate work of clearly it's also that you've developed with priestly zeal, with a pastor's heart, and with a search for the truth, and also with affection regarding the principal author whom you studied, Joseph Ratzinger. It's providential that we are able to have this defense just after his return to Rome. In the house in the Vatican just yesterday, he flew back to Rome from Germany. So it would have been sad if he had been in Germany when we were having this defense. The 3 members of the commission, we are now in Rome, although we're in separate locations connected via Google Meet. So regarding the substance of this dissertation, as I mentioned, it's clearly written with great passion, and it's written clearly, and it's a tremendous amount of work. It's the fruit of hard labor. And as Father Viego mentioned, serves an empty niche in the scholarship regarding this extremely important author for the history of thought and, of course, for the history of the church. And therefore, not only do I congratulate you, but I also hope that your work can be published as soon as possible, perhaps with some changes in agreement with the indications that we're going to give during this back and forth, during this defense. One of the features that is so passionate and exciting, enthusing about the work is that it is so biographical. This is certainly especially true of the introduction and the first chapter, and how it addresses the intellectual formation of Joseph Ratzinger. But that feature of the biographical character, to my mind as a reader, at moments deflects somewhat from what I had hoped would have really been the focus of the dissertation. And there are moments when, at least myself as the reader of this dissertation, I find that the original, let's say, main scholarly intent is goes into the background due to some other purposes within the dissertation. And those other purposes are very interesting, and clearly the author is very excited about them. And myself, I find them of interest. And I also find it to be of interest to quite a few readers. So a number of my comments are a little bit ambivalent, because I see that while there's a lot of interest here and a lot of very hard work on a topic that's extremely interesting, sometimes the central issue, which is analyzing the thought of the man, Joseph Ratzinger, in relationship to the epistemology of truth, especially relativism and overcoming relativism, is sometimes fades in the background with respect to other issues that appear more at the fore. Let me mention one example of this, and it's where I'd say I'm somewhat ambivalent because I'm really not sure exactly what's happening in these pages in the draft that I read. It's all very interesting, and it's all very intelligent, and it's well done, but I'm not really sure exactly what's going on, and it has to do with Max Scheler and Max Scheler's personalism and his phenomenology of material value. And I think it's being used as, I mean, you mentioned that he taught in Munich, I think in 1921, and there's that kind of almost coincidence kind of relationship to the life of Joseph Ratzinger. But I'm wondering, but was there a personal encounter at some point? Because of course there isn't, it's not contemporaneous. And then I'm wondering, well, did Ratzinger study Scheler? Did he use his work? And I could direct exactly to the page numbers if my memory serves me right. It's pages 65 to 67 is where this occurs. But so the pages are very interesting, and they're intelligent and they're relevant, but it leads me to wonder, but is this the thought of Ratzinger that you're speaking of, and of the influence of Max Scheler on his thought? Very much related to it, this issue of Max Scheler is immediately after those pages about Max Scheler, you develop an appreciation for Joseph Ratzinger's intellectual humility. And this is very much related to the thought of Scheler and to his phenomenology of values. And you bring up the fact that Benedict XVI chose as his motto for his pontificate Quo Operatoris Veritatis, and you use a number of, let's say, personal biographical anecdotes regarding the personal humility of the man, Joseph Ratzinger. But I'm left with the question as to what extent this is indicative of a systematic style of thought with respect to his epistemology of the truth. Now, I think there is a lot there, but I don't find that you developed it, at least not in this place in the thesis, where I think you could have, although as I should have mentioned right at the beginning, the theme is huge because we're dealing with an author that's published an enormous amount. There's an extremely extensive, vast secondary bibliography on Joseph Ratzinger. So in a sense, it's unfair to point to any gaps because this thesis could be thousands of pages long, which would be just excessive. So there is some kind of limitation that was necessary to effect in concluding the work. But nonetheless, my point here is that there's a number of moments in the thesis where I'm wondering, well, to what extent is this author really exercising a direct influence on the thought and on the writings of Ratzinger, and have you made that evident, or is there simply some kind of edifying anecdotal coincidence, which is certainly adds color and it is of interest. It's fascinating, in fact, and it makes me want to look even more into and I know that you analyze this elsewhere within the thesis, but the role of authority within philosophical and theological arguments, and of course how one's respect for the authority, including the authority of the magisterium within theology, it can certainly engage the virtue of humility, a kind of intellectual humility. But I don't see the connection being made explicitly in your analysis. If I could refer to one other author that you mentioned, who clearly exercised influence on Ratzinger and on his thought, is Joseph Pieper, and you bring him up, especially his work, the Four Virtues, which were originally published in German, of course, with the individual virtues. You make it clear that Ratzinger early on read Pieper and was influenced by his version of the Thomistic theory of virtues. And then this raised for me the question, in fact, it's related to what you brought up in your introduction regarding eros and agape, which is that work by Pieper in German. It's über die Liebe, about love, which has been much less attention has been given to it in general. But it's actually it's a beautiful, fascinating book, and Benedict XVI references it in Deus Caritas Est, early on in Deus Caritas Est, with his analysis of eros and agape. I'm left wondering if there may be much, in fact, there seems to be much more to say about Pieper and his influence on Ratzinger's own thought. But while at the same time I acknowledge that there's this complexity then of looking at the relationship between the philosophical publications, the more philosophical publications and even non-publications, personal writings that you've analyzed, produced by Joseph Ratzinger, and papal encyclicals that are often produced by there's many authors, many hands that are involved in drafting them, and is also exercising special charism as Roman Pontiff in publishing an encyclical like Deus Caritas Est, and yet I think that could have been of interest to reference to. So my point with this is you enter into fascinating features of his intellectual life, into his formation, such as you mentioned in the introduction, Ebner and Steinbucher. But there'd be so much more to address, and I'm in getting into the construction of the arguments of Benedict against relativism specifically, that I felt you certainly whetted my appetite to want to see more of that. So that each of the chapters that you've produced is fascinating and in a sense complete, but it's also that each one raises more questions for me. That makes me want to see more and more analysis, even though this could require a much longer work. So it makes me think about, it also gets me to consider the fact that the draft that you've produced has quite a few long quotations, many of which are from Ratzinger, which is appropriate, but perhaps it could have been pared down by reducing somewhat the quotations. And in the, let's say, the typography, the way you formatted things, you could have given a special, for those quotations that are longer, let's say longer than 4 lines, you could have given a special format to, in order to mark out perhaps with a smaller font also, which could have also facilitated more space for your own analysis. There's just an example of this on page 85. There's you refer to Frederick Copleston, and with quite a long quotation, which may be excessive within a dissertation like this. Regarding his own personal formation and that history, which is of course very important for your dissertation, and you bring out and expound upon fascinating features of his philosophical formation, I'm left with a question mark. I saw two different areas within your text where you deal with his second dissertation or Habilitatschrift, and the fact that there's two versions of it, and that there's a previous, in which, I mean, it's also one of the examples of the quality of your work that you refer to both of these versions and to specific features of both of these versions. But I would have liked to have known more about the reason for those parts of the first version that he had to remove. And I know that you mention on, I think it's on page 82, the role of Schmaus and his having to set aside pieces of his first draft of his Habilitatschrift. I would have been interested in hearing more about that, especially with respect to, and I think it could have been illuminative of the relationship between Ratzinger's, let's say, Franciscan, Augustinian, Bonaventuran style and a more scholastic, Thomistic style, which is probably the reason for the exclusion of those components of that first draft of the Habilitatschrift. I would have liked to have heard more of an analysis of that. I was also found really fascinating and interesting and I'm sure that your director, Father Martínez, is very expert on this. It's an area where I'm not especially expert in, but having to do with Thomism and Franciscan school of thought, and which of the two had a greater role in the development of modern science. I found those pages especially interesting when you discuss Ratzinger's preference for giving greater importance to the Franciscan role in the development of modern science. But there too, I would have loved to have heard more of an analysis and going into the texts of Benedict himself regarding that argument with respect to the Franciscans. And I'm very curious myself, though I kind of doubt that there's something there, but if there had been any reference to the role of the social sciences, and in particular economics, because in the history of economics, it's generally been the case that Franciscan schools of thought have had a much greater impact, also due to let's say, spiritual charisms of the Franciscans and the roles that they've had in society with their convents in comparison with the Dominican friars. Let's see. There's I don't want to go on too long, but so my main point is that I really appreciated your passion, your enthusiasm, and the clarity. I wish that there were a greater philosophical analysis of Benedict's thought at certain specific moments. Now, let me bring up a big issue. It's big and broad and has to do with the main theme of your thesis. And you touched upon this point in your introduction today. And I'd like to conclude my remarks with a question about this bigger theme. You mentioned in your introduction that relativism is a stance, I guess a philosophical stance, that holds that our access to the truth is dependent upon our perspective. I think that you affirmed something like that, or very close to that. Now, I find that that is actually a view that Ratzinger himself has held and holds, and has applied also in the area of biblical theology. And I find that it actually coincides quite a bit with McIntyre's approach. McIntyre, we could set him aside, although I'm also be very interested because I'm quite sure that Ratzinger has read McIntyre, at least after Virtue, but I would like to have documented proof of that. I'm pretty sure he has, and I'm pretty sure that he's at some point has actually made a explicit opposition between McIntyre and Richard Rorty. You do mention Ratzinger's critique of Rorty a number of times in your text, which I found really interesting and helpful. But regarding so your definition of relativism, which I understand was, you said that Ratzinger himself never defines it exactly, and you offered a few words about it to describe it. Now, I have especially in my mind I think it's called the prologue. It's the beginning part, could be the foreword of the prologue to the Jesus of Nazareth, the second volume of Jesus of Nazareth, which is signed Joseph Ratzinger, in which he defends an epistemology for biblical theology, in which he really holds that there is no view from nowhere for analyzing anything or anyone. Everyone, except for God himself, we're all within a perspective, and that one can choose one perspective over another, and that there are better views, better perspectives that are more privileged for accessing the truth of the matter. And it's while developing this argument, he makes the claim that the most scientific approach to coming to an understanding of the text, which is the canonical Bible, is that of the community of faith, and that the perspective of the community of faith is the scientifically most valid perspective, not the so-called neutral one perspective, which is a neutral perspective would be a perspective of doubt, or of agnosticism, at least. Ratzinger, in that preface or prologue to Jesus of Nazareth, is saying that seems to me that he's saying that we must take a perspective at any moment, and I think this is very much related to his personalism also. That because our perspective also depends upon our dialogue and our personal relations and our experience that we learn through others. And theologically, this is certainly the case insofar as we learn through the Logos, who is Logos incarnate, who is the fullness of revelation, Jesus Christ himself. And that therefore, to effect and to develop the best biblical theology, what we must do is situate ourselves within that perspective of the faith. Now, does that would seem to be relativism, according to your definition. So I would like to conclude by congratulating you and asking you if you, with your words of introduction, leave open the problem that perhaps Ratzinger is actually a relativist, according to your definition. Thank you again, Father Viego.
Okay, thank you very much, Father Robert Gahl. I guess it's better if Father Viego, you can answer to the questions at the end, after the second presentation, the second observations of the other member of the commission. So now it's the turn of Professor Santiago Sanz to make your remarks.
Good morning to all the people who are listening to us in the US. Good afternoon to my colleagues in Rome. I am the intruder here. I am the intruder because I belong to the School of Theology, and this is a doctoral thesis in the School of Philosophy. So, but I am the intruder from the beginning because I didn't remember, it was 6 or 7 years ago that it was proposed to me to co-direct this project that has come to an end. And so the first thing is also to give my congratulations to the candidate, to Father Carlos, for his work, which has been really a very deep study on one of the most important authors in the 20th century. I was wondering whether I should speak in Italian or in English, but given the circumstances, 39 people hearing, I think that obviously we have to speak in English. So I apologize for my poor English, so I will try to do my best. I prepared a different kind of intervention here. I don't want to say anything about the thesis because, as Father Carlos knows, I have said many things during these years, many things, many criticisms, that he has taken into consideration. Some of them he has taken in serious consideration. Other ones were in the type of possibilities that could be taken or not. So anyway, I just wanted to say a couple of things today, just considering the people who are hearing us, and perhaps they are bored, no, asking, hearing about very specific questions, no. Well, what I wanted to say today in this special moment is that well, I have to make a pre-consideration. So if I am here is because I have studied the thought of Ratzinger from the theological point of view. I have directed 3 doctoral theses, one on creation and original sin, the other one is in the relationship between metaphysics and the history of salvation, and the third one on the dogmatic famous axiom, medieval axiom, gratia supponit naturam, in the thought of Ratzinger. So these are the 3 doctoral works that I have directed. And as the Father Carlos very well knows, I have had the opportunity to study some manuscripts on the lessons of Joseph Ratzinger on the Doctrine of Creation. Normally, it has been said during these minutes, sometimes Ratzinger is considered as a theologian who is hard and important in liturgy, in ecclesiology, but not so frequently it is put the accent in one of the aspects of his theological thought, that is the importance that he has given to the doctrine of creation. And as you can imagine, because it is it's very easy to take conscience of this, the doctrine of creation is a kind of bridge between philosophy and theology. So, and it has to do with the doctrine of truth and relativism and so on. So my presence here is due to these facts, and with this presentation, what I wanted to say today is very simple. I wanted to give a couple of quotations to demonstrate how the thought of Ratzinger, that can be described as relational, dialogical, personalistic, and so on and so far, can be complementary to the thought of Aquinas, in the sense that if we can find in Ratzinger a personalistic view of human being and of God, etc., the metaphysical approach of Aquinas is not opposed to this. Father Gahl has reminded the affair in the habilitation scripts, with Smaus, the Smaus affair, when the 2/3 of the doctoral, the habilitation work of Ratzinger was cancelled because it was considered as modernist, because he said that revelation is given in history, and this was a kind of reminder of modernism and a kind of refutation of truth as absolute. I will say something at the end about this. So I think it's very important. I have here a quotation. It comes from an article Ratzinger published in the 60s about history of salvation and eschatology, in which he says that if in the first years of his career as a theologian, for him it was very important history of salvation, because, as you know, in the theology of the 20th century, especially around the Second Vatican Council, is the history salvation approach, trying to escape from the dogmatic approach of some kind of neo-scholasticism that presented truth as a kind of block, a kind of of stone fallen from heaven to earth, no? That you have to adhere to, you have to accept, and you don't consider the historical dimension of truth and revelation. So it's very important, because in the 60s, in this article, in the second version of the article, Ratzinger says about his approach, he says, "Today, I would insist stronger in the priority of ontology and then of metaphysics as the basis of every history. Precisely as a confession of Jesus Christ, Christian faith is faith in the living God. The fact that the first article of faith constitutes the fundament of Christian faith includes, from the theological point of view, the fundamental character of the ontological affirmations and the basic character of metaphysics, that is, God the Creator, that comes before every becoming." I have translated into English right now because I prepared everything in Italian, so excuse me for my translation in the online translation in the moment. But the sense, the meaning of this quotation is how Ratzinger in the late 60s and in the 70s has realized that the historical approach has to be considered in communion and in cooperation with the metaphysical approach. The second quotation, Ratzingerian quotation, that I wanted to put here in this discussion regards the relation between immortality of the soul and resurrection of the body. If you consider the Introduction to Christianity, which is the bestseller of Ratzinger, a lot of editions, we have today editions that come from this book, that is the fruit of some lessons given to lay people in Tübingen in the late 60s. In this book, you can find a Ratzinger that is very near to his friend Karl Rahner and other theologians of the moment, which are involved in the famous anthropologische Wende, the anthropological movement in theology in those years. And in fact, if you go to his consideration of immortality of the soul, you will find a very minimalistic presentation. You will find a presentation that highlights resurrection of the body and that says that, well, immortality of the soul is not so important from the natural point of view, because what we believe as Catholics is resurrection of the body. And so he was not so friendly with notions, with scholastic notions as separated soul, for example. You can find this, well, I have the Italian version of this, pages 290, and anyway, you can find this in the English version very easily. So he was not so friend of these scholastic notions of separated soul, and he said, for example, in this book, immortality is just pure grace. And it's not something that comes from the nature of man. So it's a kind of Protestant-friendly approach to the question, no? But if you go to his handbook on eschatology, which is published 8 years later, so Introduction to Christianity is 1968, his manual of eschatology is 1977, we have to say that he considers his book on eschatology his most perfect work as theologian. He says this in his famous autobiography, Milestones. So if you go to eschatology and the treatment he deserves to the immortality of the soul, you'll find something different. Not completely different, but different. Because in his eschatology, we could say that he has reconciled himself with Aquinas, what was not so clear in terms of to Christianity. And he understands and explains that immortality of the soul is a gift of creation. And being a gift of creation, obviously, it has a natural aspect that is not, we cannot avoid, and is important also. So it's very interesting to compare his treatment on immortality of the soul in Introduction to Christianity and Eschatology, and you see the different approach is the same as I said before. Well, I could also tell to you, just to make a kind of theological journalism, and that one of the points of this kind of, I wouldn't say a complete change in his mind, because it's not a complete change, but it's a development in his view. He directed a doctoral thesis in the first 70s in Regensburg. The candidate was a priest of Schoenstatt movement, Michael Johannes Marman. He became later the head of this movement, and this is the reason why he didn't publish his doctoral thesis. It has been published recently in Italian by a student of mine who has studied. It's the doctoral thesis I mentioned before on Gratia Supponit Naturam in Ratzinger's theology. In this doctoral thesis, Marman says that Gratia Supponit Naturam, the medieval axiom, is not a Bonaventurean contribution, but a Thomist contribution. And the director of this thesis is Ratzinger, who is a Bonaventurean. So it's very interesting this, because Ratzinger then has quoted this work. You can find it as one of the first quotations in his famous Addend to Creation and Fall, the consequences of faith in creation. You have used this chapter in your thesis. One of the first quotations is this doctoral thesis. So Ratzinger has been convinced with the years of the importance of Aquinas, obviously. So and I wanted to quote these two texts, and I wanted to finish with my third quotation of today. My third quotation is a double quotation, because I wanted to compare for a moment a couple of texts. One is 1910, so in the modernist crisis. In this text says, I am translating from Italian, so I am sorry if I don't translate well. I am absolutely convinced and declare firmly that faith is not a blind sentiment, religious sentiment, that comes from the darkness of subconscious, or a kind of something that comes from heart. But faith is a true assent of the intellect to a truth that is received from ahead, from preaching, and then being convinced of the authority absolutely true of God, we believe everything that God, the personal God, creator and Lord, has said, has revealed. Okay, this is the style of the anti-modernist oath. The anti-modernist oath. This is a text from the anti-modernist oath. Let's compare this text with other text that comes from 2013. So the other day, we could say, yesterday, 7 years ago. The text says this: faith for me comes from the encounter with Jesus, a personal encounter that has touched my heart and has even an address and a new meaning to my existence. At the same time, it is a meeting, an encounter made possible by the community of faith in which I have lived, and thanks to what I have found access to the intelligence of scriptures. Well, this is from Pope Francis. Well, the anti-modernist oath, faith doesn't come from heart, it's a truth that comes from heaven, so I believe. Pope Francis, faith comes from the encounter with Christ. That moves it's a truth, but this truth moves my heart. Well, it's 100 years difference between both tests. What is in the middle of this that makes possible because I would say both tests are not in contradiction, are in perfect continuity, because one is highlighting a dimension and the other is highlighting the other dimension. And they are in perfect continuity because the second one is not denying the importance of truth. What happened in the middle that made possible the passage from the first to the second? I would say Second Vatican Council, and obviously theologians as Ratzinger, that made possible that we can combine the importance of, we would say, the absolute for Christianity, that God is the absolute being is important, but for Christianity, the absolute is also relative, because the persons of the Trinity are relations. So Christianity is the combination of absolute and relative. And what made possible the passage from the anti-modernist oath to the words we have heard from Francis, I would say is precisely Second Vatican Council, especially the work of theologians as Ratzinger. So I wanted to say all these things because I think it's my commentary to your doctoral thesis, because I think we go in this direction, just to show how the thought of Ratzinger has allowed this we would say with this development of sensibility that allows to combine, to put together the intellectual approach, the objective approach to truth, and also the personal approach, the subjective approach, the dialogical approach to truth. So congratulations for your work. I think it will be very, very interesting to publish it and obviously everything that goes in this direction to show also the continuity of Catholic faith during these decades is very important. So congratulations again, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Okay. Father Robert Connor has given an applause to your speech. So thank you very much, Father Santiago, Professor Santiago Sanz. And now is my turn to make my observations and remarks. But also in my case, I think I don't want to say anything specific about the contents of the thesis. All my suggestions and observations has been already presented to the author during these 7 years. I would like to only to stress the importance of the argument, of the topic of the thesis, that's something that Father Viego has already done in his presentation. So I consider really that was one of the reasons because I accepted the direction of this doctoral research. I thought it was not my field of study. I am working mainly in philosophy of science and philosophy of nature, and my knowledge, my technical knowledge and philosophical and theological knowledge of Joseph Ratzinger was not particularly deep. But I accepted this thesis because I consider that relativism is really a central problem of today's philosophy and theology, and mainly because it has a great impact on social and religious aspects of reality. So, and I have really appreciated the courage of Father Viego addressing this question that is not easy to consider from the point of view of a theologian as Joseph Ratzinger. Well, of course, this thesis has had also some difficulties. First of all, the distance. After the first year, we were separated by the ocean, and I think we meet only once after the first year, last year in Navarra, in Spain, for a couple of days, and it was a fantastic meeting. Well, another difficulty has been related with the language. Well, we were here in Rome working in Italian, and so making all our contacts in Italian, bibliography in Italian. But obviously, Father Viego and myself, we were speaking usually in Spanish. The thesis was in English, and we were working on German texts very commonly. So that sometimes has put some problems in what translations use, how to address the different languages, if translating, if putting the original quotations or not, something like that. But anyway, so I think that all the other difficulties more important than these two small difficulties was the fact were linked to the author we were studying and the topic we were covering. So I think that one of the difficulties of this thesis was the fact that the author, although was called Joseph Ratzinger, was also Benedict XVI. And that made very complex the use of his bibliography, because his works has been published lots of times in many different versions, in many different books and papers outside the academic context. And that makes sometimes very difficult to distinguish which is the real work of Joseph Ratzinger and the thought of the Pope Benedict, and sometimes we know the thought also of the people that were collaborating with the Pope Benedict. Fortunately, we have the help of Professor Santiago Sanz, that, as you have understood, is one of the best scholars today in the thought, in the theological thought of Joseph Ratzinger. And we try to overcome all these difficulties. Well, the other question that particularly in the evolution of this thesis was that the theological and the practical aspects of the thesis had become always more important during the preparation of the thesis. In Italy, we were thinking of working mainly in the epistemological aspects of relativism and truth, and the theory, the understanding of knowledge and truth in Joseph Ratzinger. But Joseph Ratzinger is not a philosopher from one side, although he has a deep philosophical knowledge from all his formation. And I have to remark that the thesis during these 7 years has evolved mainly in the direction of a more theological, in some way, and practical research. So truth and relativism has been considered by Father Carlos Viego more and more related with the practical, the practical attitudes of the person and the social and political dimensions of relativism, and less in the epistemological aspects. And obviously, I consider myself less competent in these political and social and theological aspects, but we try to complete this research with the help of Father Sanz, and I think that the result has been very, very interesting and important. So I am also to express my gratitude to Father Viego for his enthusiasm in following this research and this dissertation. Of course, during 7 years, there are also moments of deep depression for his part and for my part, but we try to overcome everything. And I think that each time we were reading and working with the writings of Joseph Ratzinger, we find many suggestions in order to overcome that feeling. And so I am grateful also to Father Viego for one of that I consider is one of the most important merits of this thesis, that is his deep research through all the writings of Joseph Ratzinger, and mainly the first part of his writings, his doctoral dissertations, and his work as a young professor in Tübingen. And I am also very grateful for his positive attitude in accepting all the suggestions and many changes and many observations that he has received during this time. Yeah. So thank you for him. Thank you to Father Professor Santiago Sanz, and I also hope that this research will be published. Probably Father Viego has now the occasion to publish this doctoral dissertation. I would say in the way that he was probably thinking of at the beginning of his research. So that's an essay, a book that could reach many people, many not only scholars, but also many Christian Catholic people that could find in all the reflections he is presenting in the thesis in a very useful way in order to know in a deeper way their faith, and in order to live in a deeper way their Christian life. So congratulations. And now we have arrived to the end of these remarks. So Father Carlos Viego has now the possibility to answer or to make some last remarks on the thesis.
Thank you very much, Father Martínez and Father Sanz and Father Gahl. My first remark is I hope to be brief, and I'm a little surprised by the lack of brevity of Father Gahl's remarks, and I appreciate that. I very much appreciate it, but I likewise appreciate Father Sanz and Father Martínez mercy in this moment, because as Father Martínez has indicated, it has been a difficult journey for both of us, and it's a joyful moment. And actually, and that is in very good professorial fashion, because a good professor says what he has to says, and then absents himself, so, and in defense of Father Gahl's criticism, he just came on board with this. Father Sanz and Father Martínez have been with me the whole while, very generously, and I kind of cajoled both of them into this. Father Martínez, I had to force Father Martínez to take my direction of a thesis in Joseph Ratzinger, which was not his competence, right at the beginning, because nobody else in the faculty would take the defense of Joseph Ratzinger, because Joseph Ratzinger is not a philosopher. He's a theologian. And the solution that Father Martínez proposed, and that I proposed, Father Martínez proposed that I do a topic that he thought was related to his competence, which is relativism, truth and relativism. And the other solution that I propose is that we would have someone from the theology faculty, whom I had found, Father Santiago Sanz, who was an expert, a world expert in Joseph Ratzinger's thought. And by the way, Father Santiago Sanz, I have to disagree with you when you say you're a theologian, because you are also a philosopher. You have a doctorate in philosophy, so you are both an expert philosopher, even though you're not working in that capacity primarily. But you certainly have the tools, which you've shown me in your wise criticisms of my thesis and your guidance throughout. So I'll deal mainly with Father Gahl's comments, and briefly. I don't think we need to get bogged down in the details, but the first comment I would make relates to what Father Gahl says and what Father Martínez ended saying regarding what I would call the pastoral nature of my thesis. And I have an apology for that. I have a defense for that. And that is, I'm a parish priest. And I have been in full-time parish ministry throughout the writing of this thesis. Even while I was in Rome, it was part-time parish ministry. I was helping in a parish in Rome. So I never ceased to do the parish work and to have the pastoral perspective. That is I am a priest. And so the practical aspect and the theological aspect is primary. But also in defense of that, I would say that is also Joseph Ratzinger's dilemma throughout his career. He says he was dissected 3 times in his academic career. He was dissected when he was ordained a priest, when he was ordained a bishop, and when he was made pope, because all of his academic work had to be put at the service of real living people and not an abstraction. But that's also the genius of his philosophical thought. And that is the point of Ferdinand Ebner. The personalism of Ferdinand Ebner is that the truth, as alluded to by Father Sanz, is not the monolithic, objective, absolute, unrelated object that comes down to the earth. The truth is the person. And every other truth that we know in reality, including every science, comes from the truth of the person. And Father Sanz also made that point, the point regarding creation and the Thomist and the lack of a better way to say it, Franciscan perspectives of philosophy is reconciled in Ratzinger attempts to reconcile the abstract notion of truth with the practical notion of truth in his view of creation. He says in his course on creation, which Father Sanz referenced, his Münster 1966 Münster course on on Creation, if I'm not mistaken, 64, excuse me. It was Father Sanz wrote 3 articles, published 3 articles in the results of his studies of Ratzinger's course on creation, in the 70s course on creation, excuse me, 1964. And in that, in the beginning of the second article, he mentions that creation is relational, that God didn't make the world and then, according to Ratzinger's course on creation, God didn't make the world and then later choose his people. No, the creation itself was covenantal. That is the view of the scripture, and that is the view of Joseph Ratzinger, that creation is a personal encounter of love between God and the world, which is manifested later in the choosing of his people, and then opening that in Christ to the whole world. So that's my first point, and also the trajectory of my work, these 7 years, this brief academic work. I'm not an academician, but also I would say neither was Ferdinand Ebner. He wasn't a philosopher, but he became a philosopher, and he learned his philosophy from 4 sources. Ferdinand Ebner was a lifelong school teacher. That was his career. That's what he studied, and he taught children. And he learned his philosophy about the person, about the fundamental truth of reality from his Catholic faith, from his work with children, and from his from music, and from his relationship with women, from his marriage and another relationship with a woman with whom he was very close, and he received very keen insights into the heart of reality through those relationships. So that's my defense of the pastoral nature of my work. It flows naturally from the work of Ratzinger, and the blurring of the lines between theology and philosophy are necessary in that. That's Joseph Ratzinger. That's Bonaventure, and Ratzinger makes the case that is even Thomas Aquinas. That Thomas Aquinas is not this, that the truth is an idea separate from reality, or some mathematical principles that be applied to reality but are separate. That Aquinas is more complex than that, and some of the work that has been done to further the work of Joseph Ratzinger has investigated that, as indicated by Santiago Sanz and Robert Barron's doctoral thesis on creation, in the thought of Thomas Aquinas compared with that of Tillich, is an example of that. I fear that I've gone very much longer than I wanted on that first point, so I don't think I'm going to cover all the points made by Father Gahl, but let me see if there's at least one other big well, I can make a point regarding Max Scheler. I mentioned Max Scheler because of the connection to John Paul II, because at the beginning of the thesis, I had the idea that I would continue with a 4th chapter, and it would dovetail into comparing John Paul II's thought with that of Joseph Ratzinger. But it didn't come out that way. But I also would say that humility, that thought about humility, is quite integral to the whole thesis. Joseph Ratzinger says, and that's why I brought in Max Scheler in the context of the 1st chapter, because Ratzinger had discovered in Augustine that one of the major truths realized by Augustine when he, in his 3rd conversion, when he accepted Christianity, was the acceptance of the truth, the humility of the truth, which is manifested in the incarnation of the Word. That the closeness of this logos, this faraway logos of the Greeks, becomes close and personal in the person of Christ. And that is it's what Ratzinger frequently calls, and it's throughout my thesis, especially in the 2nd and 3rd chapters, repeatedly, Joseph Ratzinger says that the solution to Immanuel Kant's pura, ratio pura, is it needs the complement of ratio purgata, which is heart. It needs that reason, human reason, truly human reason, is also humane. That there's a that it is alive, and it's in living persons where it's understood and played out. I think this is fundamental to philosophy. I think this is Ratzinger's point, and I think that's why I think that this thesis and both professors who have guided me in this, and also Father Gahl, they think it's also important because of that new emphasis in philosophy, which began with phenomenology. But phenomenology has the danger of falling into subjectivism if it's not well grounded in revelation. This is Ratzinger's point. Ratzinger makes the point regarding modernity that since the Enlightenment, the attitude of the intellectual establishment has been to work as if God did not exist, to solve our problems by ourselves. And Ratzinger says that has shown its bankruptcy in the greatest horrors of humanity in the First World War and the Second World War, and I would add in the abortion that is the Great War right now, which everyone seems to ignore. I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there, but it was the humility, the obedience to the revelation which is necessary. So Ratzinger said that instead of treating God as if he did not exist as our presupposition, and rightly, as Father Gahl said, everybody has a perspective, and I acknowledge that throughout my thesis, that Ratzinger knows everybody has his perspective. Relativism, the problem of relativism, as I said in my introduction, Father Gahl, is not that everyone has a perspective. Ratzinger fully affirms that reality of epistemology and of the human reality of everyone having a point, a perspective, which is part of modern science's genius contribution to philosophy today. But the problem with relativism is that it takes the perspective as the absolute truth. It denies that there is an overriding truth. Ratzinger condemns total relativism. But interestingly, every time Ratzinger uses the term relativism without exception, I found out in my thesis, that in my research, that without exception, he always uses the term relativism in the absolute sense. When he talks about the person, he talks about relativity or relation or relationship, never relativism. It's the ism which is the problem. It's the replacing of the truth with the ism. Again, I'm going long. Oh, but Ratzinger says that the solution to the Deus non datur of the Enlightenment, to do our intellectual work and our social work with as if God did not exist, that we would solve it ourselves. The bankruptcy of that, the solution to the modern problem, which Ratzinger suggests, he proposes, is to do our work as if God did exist. Since we all have to take a perspective, take the high road of metaphysics and of Jesus Christ, of God being a person, that the truth exists and that the truth is a person. I think I should just probably stop. There was one other point I wanted to make regarding Father Gahl's comments, and that is continuing on that same theme regarding relativism as perspective. I would like to point the audience and the professors to one of Ratzinger's solutions in that regard, specifically regarding the historical critical method, which was referenced by Father Gahl as an example of how Ratzinger takes, in Jesus of Nazareth and other places, how Ratzinger takes perspective as very important and the historical reality. Ratzinger developed what is now being called academically a new scriptural method. In scriptural scholarship, there's a method A, which is historical critical method, science without faith. There's a method B, which is the fathers and the dogma of the church. Ratzinger proposes a third method, which is his method C. There are books written on this. Method C of scripture interpretation by Joseph Ratzinger to solve the problem of relativism, that everything is perspective, is that scripture should be read reading the sacred scripture, reading the fathers of the church, using the historical critical method, and within the faith of the believer. All four contributions are essential, and they're checks on one another. That's all I would have to say regarding Father Gahl's comments. And let me see, regarding Father Sanz's comments, thank you for being an intruder. You are a necessary intruder in this work and very expert. And all of your comments, even the comments today, I'll be considering for some time to come, God willing. And Father Martínez, what do I have to say to Father Martínez? One last word. Thank you for the comment that you made. No, thank you for your passionate contribution to this work with me. It's been a great consolation and a great help, a great and necessary help. And I think your last comment, that we have produced a very, very important result, is perhaps hyperbolic, but I very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Viego. Now the members of the commission will left this meeting in order to deliberate about the result of this thesis. Please be here, be patient. We will stay for a few minutes outside, and we will see here in a few minutes. I cannot say the exact time. Thank you very much.
Everyone who is here, thank you for coming. I hope I still have a microphone. Maybe I don't. Let me see. Can someone indicate whether you can hear me? I'm not going to talk to you the whole time.
Yes, we can hear you, Father. God bless you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm going to pray the sext, one of the offices of the breviary, as we wait for them to come back. I don't know if it's appropriate that we all start talking now. So I want to second Father Martínez's motion to just hold tight and see what they come up with. Hopefully they come up with summa cum laude. And I have my beretta here ready. I can't see myself, but maybe you can see. I'm going to see if I can put that on. That's the doctoral beretta, according to the protocol of Catholic University of America. If you'll notice, it's different from a normal beretta. A normal beretta has 3 sides, and the left side is without a point. This one has 4 points. Similar to the cardinal beretta, it's black, the priestly black, but it takes the blue piping for the philosophy degree, the blue pom-pom. Maybe I'll dare to put that on when they give me my grade. But I'll pray now, and I'll ask for you to do whatever you want until they come back. You can leave if you want.
I have a question. I have a question.
This is my brother Francisco Viego. Yes, Francisco.
Yeah, so my question, it's probably a dumb question, but so I've never been to a thesis dissertation before. The question is, why are all the criticisms being brought forth now and not prior to this, so that potentially it could have improved the work and not make this just okay, everything's good now. There's no point in, there being a back and forth.
Very good. Thank you, Francisco. Well, any work of this magnitude is going to have, because of it is such a large work and new research, it's going to have gaps, what are called gaps. And I have found many more problems than they indicated today. The only man who indicated problems today was the man who never saw the thesis before and never talked to me about it, Father Gahl. So it's proper to have that an objective new observer. The other two professors have been with me for 7 years, directing it all the while, and it was much worse at the beginning. We have perfected it. So that would be my answer. We've done the best we could, and I just read it again over the past week and found at least 100 errors and one major faux pas, which they didn't mention. Thank God. Don't tell them. But now to publish it, it seems I can make some adjustments, and this interaction is very helpful for that. Thank you for that question.
Good job in your defense, though. I was getting a little concerned there.
And thank you for everybody being here. It's really a great support to have had 40 people at this meeting, and some of whom are experts in this field, and very helpful. Thank you. I'm going to pray. I'm going to pray the 6 hour, if you don't mind. Please excuse me. I'll sit right here, but I'll pray in silence.